All right. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's emergency summit titled America Besieged by Racism, Materialism, and Militarism. My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint, not just because militarism makes America less safe, but also because it erodes our democracy and our civil liberties. Which brings us to today's topic and summit. In light of the attack on the Capitol last month, a conversation about how American militarism, combined with racism and materialism, are fraying the social fabric of our society is long overdue. To address this important issue, we have an excellent panel that will be moderated by none other than QI President Andrew Basovich himself. This summit is a little bit different from our other webinars in the sense that we have more panelists and it's the beginning of a conversation. And as a result, we will not do a Q&A with the audience, but there will be plenty of future opportunities to engage in this conversation. So with no further ado, please welcome Andrew, who will introduce the panelists and start the summit. Andrew?
Thank you, Sridhar. Welcome, everyone. I am Andrew Basovich, president of the Quincy Institute. Our purpose today, as Sridhar suggested, is to begin what we hope will be a continuing conversation keyed to the core problems besetting our nation. As Sridhar suggested, QI's purpose specifically relates to war in promoting foreign policies that do not involve endless war. But for many of us at QI, the assault on the Capitol that occurred on January 6th drove home the point that our problems include but go well beyond militarism itself. And that revelation brought us back to Martin Luther King's famous Riverside Church address of 1967, when he identified what he called the three giant triplets of racism, extreme militarism, and materialism and militarism working together as issues that demand attention. So today we aim to re-examine that proposition. And to help us do that, we've assembled a very distinguished group of discussants who I will introduce only very briefly in the interest of time. First, we have Professor Danielle Allen, who is the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard University, longtime columnist for the Washington Post, currently writes for The Atlantic. Peter Beinart is professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, contributing opinion writer to the New York Times, also the author of a new Substack newsletter. Professor Nita Crawford, dear friend of mine from my days at Boston University. Nita is professor of political science, chair of the political science department at BU, also co-director of the very important Costs of War project. Dan McCarthy. Dan McCarthy is one of the leading conservative thinkers of our day. Currently, he is the editor of the journal Modern Age. He is also editor-at-large at the American Conservative magazine. And finally, Reverend Liz Theo Harris. Reverend Theo Harris is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, and she teaches at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Our aim, again, is to have a discussion with plenty of back and forth, rather than a series of long speeches. And with that, I'd like to begin with Peter Beinart, who will only be able to be with us for a limited period of time. Peter, to what extent does Dr. King's depiction of racism, extreme materialism, and materialism, the three operating in combination with one another, to what extent does that analysis retain value as a description of the fundamental values afflicting American society? And if that analysis is no longer relevant, what should replace it? Looking beyond his triplets, What forces threaten American democracy? Floor is yours.
Thank you. I wonder if today perhaps he might not have used the word materialism, only because I think it may be to some degree a remnant of a period in the 1960s when people assumed that American living standards would be going up in a way they do not today. So for instance, in the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, in the Port Huron statement, they talk about those of us who bred in at least modest comfort. I think there may have been a little bit of economic optimism that existed in that period that it doesn't exist in today. It's not to say materialism isn't an enormous spiritual and cultural problem, but I think many Americans also suffer from a serious lack of materialism and very little hope that their material circumstances will improve. I think that the term militarism is enormously important because it is largely fallen out of mainstream political use. Instead, we hear euphemisms like a muscular foreign policy or a tough-minded foreign policy. When was the last time you opened a newspaper and heard an American politician described as militarist or warlike? So I think, again, it's a beautiful example of King kind of cutting through the euphemisms that separate us from what is actually really happening. And I think that the twinning of militarism and racism is profoundly important because we do live in an era now, you hear this from the Biden folks all the time, that we need to think about the interconnectedness between domestic and foreign policy. And yet they don't, I think, draw the kinds of connections between those two things that Martin Luther King did in his Riverside Church speech. Just to quote a sentence of it, he writes, "As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems, but they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam?" That's the kind of connection between American foreign policy and American domestic policy. About the way in which we unthinkingly legitimize American violence overseas without thinking about what that does to our society and what that message that sends, let alone thinking about what it does to resource distribution. I think it's that interconnection, thinking about violence, the violence we use against people overseas without thinking about it very much, and then the way in which it makes our society more cruel and more violent. I think that's a connection that is very relevant today.
Danielle Allen, I wonder if I could get your thoughts on the same basic question, the continuing relevance of the three triplets.
Well, it's funny, when I draw on King a lot, and I tend to draw on King to focus actually on a concept of disempowerment and the need to achieve power sharing throughout society. And it's striking to me that disempowerment is not one of the elements of the triplet here. But I think that's actually the core of what we're wrestling with in our society right now, which is swaths of our population on both sides of the political spectrum experience massive disempowerment. To some extent, that is connected to the material issues that Peter mentioned. And then that disempowerment gets expressed as people sort of try to take power back in a variety of forms, some of which are quite awful, as in the examples of the sort of groups that have formed around white supremacist ideologies. Some folks form solidarities around projects of broad and inclusive empowerment. I'm thinking of Reverend Theo Harris's Poor People's Movement, which I take to be a quite inclusive effort to redress problems of disempowerment. But for me, that's really the core, this issue of disempowerment and the question of what's brought that about and how to respond to it.
But is empowerment then in addition to the triplets, or does empowerment transcend the triplets?
I think in various ways we have problems with all three of the triplets. I just wouldn't start the analysis there. I would start the analysis from the problem of disempowerment.
Reverend Theo Harris, could you pitch in, give us your thoughts on this?
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's quite an honor to be in this conversation. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, really does start with Dr. King's three triplets, and the evils that he describes them as. In different ones of his speeches, he talks about materialism as economic exploitation or even as poverty. And we live, more than 50 years later from this time in a moment when 140 million people in this country are poor, or one storm, one healthcare crisis, one job loss, one emergency from actually desperate economic ruin, and where we have fewer voting rights and emboldened white supremacist organizations. And so when you see those three that he talked about, we live in a society that spends, the federal government spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on the military, and less than 15 cents on healthcare and education and anti-poverty programs combined. And so those three evils and the way that they intersect and interlock with each other is still very alive and well, especially in the lives of the close to half of the U.S. population that is experiencing, economic ruin. We also have needed to put two other injustices into conversation with those three triplets. One is the problem of ecological devastation. We are living in a moment when, in 2020, climate events cost more than $1 trillion to just the United States alone, let alone the people that are being killed and whose lives and livelihoods are being damaged by an ecological crisis. And then also, as we saw so, I think, plainly at the US Capitol on January 6th, we have an emboldened Christian nationalist movement. And so that we have to see the ways that, myself as a person of faith and as a faith leader, we have to see the ways that religious nationalism has come in to basically be a priest of empire, of injustice, and not a chaplain for social justice and the issues that are most central to our sacred texts and traditions. And so we put those 5 issues together, those interlocking injustices, and say, to understand the US and the world today, we have to see racism and poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and this war economy, and this distorted narrative, this false moral narrative of Christian and religious nationalism as injustices that have to be addressed. Much like Dr. King talked about, one, but you can't get rid of one without getting the others.
But therefore, the problems are bigger. The problems are more varied than in 1967.
I think the problems are broad and deeper than they were more than 50 years ago. If we just calculate who is in poverty today and the level of poverty, there's 60% more people who are poor. If we look at the issues of militarism and the war economy, again, we have wars declared and undeclared in so many places across the world. The U.S. has military bases in more than 800 places. I mean, it's just grown, and therefore it's going to take, a grassroots response to be able to right these wrongs and to make society better for everybody.
Nita Crawford, much of your research and writing focuses on the specific problem of militarism. But what's your reaction to the conversation that we've had thus far?
Well, I'm really amazed listening. I listened yesterday again to the speech. I hadn't listened to it in years. And I was amazed at how relevant it was and how perceptive about the problems the US would face. So the only thing I would have added to this would be, and maybe to King, would be to focus on the ways or to underscore how militarism and war are antithetical values, right? How they're antithetical to democracy and the processes of a functioning democracy. So he talks about democracy as an antidote to communism, but I think democracy is the antidote to militarism and racism. And in particular, if Commander comments after the speech that he couldn't actually riff on King, he has to essentially just add some historical context. But I'll just riff on King. I'll just take that prerogative and just say, if we focus on the ways that militarism and war undermine democracy, then I think we can see that at root, King's prescription could have gone much further. And when he says, democracy is the antidote to communism, he could have said, democracy is the antidote to militarism and extreme materialism, as well as racism. So, in other words, democracy is about the force of the better argument, war is decision by force. The evaluation of arguments requires that we know our history and can make reasoned choices. And nationalism blinds us to our history. And democracy is about the sharing of political power. War concentrates power in the executive. So many of the things that war does diminishes the democracy that King sees as the way out.
I want to come back to democracy, and in particular, what can be done to salvage our democracy. But before we do that, let's get Dan McCarthy to offer his perspective on this first set of questions, this question of the relevance of King's analysis from 1967. Dan?
Yeah, things have changed a bit since 1967, but the idea of these terrible triplets is still very much relevant. And in particular, triplet is a useful metaphor for these three threats because they play into one another, and in fact, they have a genetic relationship. Take materialism, for example. Clearly, liberty remains something that Americans are still very much concerned about. But liberty simply for the sake of materialist ends, simply for the sake of consuming and getting more, is extremely hollow, and it doesn't really satisfy the moral desires that people quite naturally feel. Well, this is where militarism, unfortunately, comes into the picture. Because if we look at the wars we've conducted, certainly over the last 30 years, and in fact, perhaps rather longer, we see that these wars are always framed as moral crusades. They are ways in which our authorities go to the public and say, we are fighting this war for the sake of a grand moral cause that is selfless, and that in fact is going to try to save people in foreign countries from some threat that may be coming from over their borders or that may be arising from tyranny at home. So it's a way of taking the spiritual malaise that infests a materialistic culture and saying that we're going to take this malaise, take this kind of feeling of discontent, and we're going to assuage it by having a great moral cause that is beyond our own borders and that is going to take the form of a sort of Manichaean military clash between St. George and the Dragon, between good and evil. And for a short time, this may mobilize the country, but eventually, of course, it winds up creating a great deal more disillusionment and a great deal more dissatisfaction with our country. And then racism factors into this, because racism has, of course, created a great deal of appropriate guilt among the American public and among America's leadership class. Well, to assuage this guilt, our militaristic adventures abroad are framed always in strongly anti-racist terms. So I recall when I opposed the Iraq War in 2003, people on the opposing side, people who supported the Iraq War, they would claim that it was racist not to support a war against Iraq. And that, of course, sounds absurd. It sounds crazy, and it is absurd and crazy. But their argument was that if you were opposed to the Iraq War, that meant you were opposed to Arab democracy. It meant that you thought that Arabs were inherently incapable of self-government and that they deserved to be consigned to tyranny. Now, of course, that was a falsehood. That was a lie. That was something that was, sort of perpetuated not only by the Bush administration, but by so much of our own media, unfortunately. Nevertheless, you can see how guilt was being translated into support for an unjust war, and how that unjust war itself was a way of assuaging the discontent people feel over materialism. So I think these triplets remain very closely interrelated. And if we're going to fight them, we have to understand the complexities of the ways in which they interact today.
Thank you. Peter Beinart is going to bail out on us in about 3 or 4 minutes. So I want to shift to a second big question and give Peter a chance to weigh in before he has to leave us. Peter, in his speech, Dr. King insisted on the imperative of the United States undergoing what he called a radical revolution of values. That was the phrase he used. Transforming the United States, again, quoting here, from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. To what extent does that prescription remain valid? What would a revolution in values entail today? What would it look like? Your thoughts?
Wow. I don't know that I can really do justice to that question.
In 2 minutes.
Yes, and I apologize. I hate to leave. It's only because I have to teach. But I guess I would go back to something that Daniel said that I thought was very, very apt, because that I think that there was the way the United States responded to September 11th, leading to the Iraq War, was partly about the sense that that there was a lot of this discussion at that time. The United States needed a grand effort and it is really still so much today when we think about what America can do that's big and a kind of whole of society effort. We still so much are drawn by the weight of the military and the military and the power and military power, so that so much of the mainstream foreign policy conversation today is really about how to rise to meet the challenge of China. But that conversation is so often framed essentially as, how do we meet the security challenge of China? Even when there's a little bit of discussion about how, yes, we should reinvest in technology and improve our education and stuff, it's still oriented around the idea of a common enemy that's perceived as a threat. And one of the things that I worry about is that we are in a moment that has some similarities with the early 1960s, which is that there is this strong bipartisan ability to unite around the idea of a common threat. And even some people who have a progressive domestic agenda may think that they can surf that progressive domestic agenda on this notion of a kind of a new Cold War, as some of the kind of best and brightest liberals of the 1960s did. And it was King broke with that in an extremely powerful way in the Vietnam War speech. He saw that you couldn't, as Ned and others were saying, you couldn't have these two at the same time, that the one would consume the other. And I worry that we may be going down that road again with this kind of new Cold War with China.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for joining us. Good luck with your course. Stay in touch.
Thank you. I will.
I should have said at the outset to each of you, if don't wait to be called on. If you have something to say it. If you want to wave your hand at me so I call you on, please do that. We want to have a little bit of a spontaneity here rather than me pretending like I'm in charge. All of that said, Danielle, you recently wrote a piece in which you talked about the need for what you called a new social compact. And I don't know if the new social compact kind of connects to Dr. King's radical revolution and values, but it certainly points to the need for fundamental change in American society. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about what that new social compact would consist of, and how it would then respond to whether it's triplets or quintuplets, but the fundamentals that are besetting our society.
Sure. Yes. The new social compact would be about a revolution in values. It is about putting people first. I think that is the core idea, and reconnecting, recovering a deep understanding of what it means to be connected to one another across this broad and contentious society. I'll come back to that in a second, though, because I think there are a couple of things to say about how the military plays a different role in our society now than it did in 1967, which are pertinent to our present moment. So, of course, the draft has ended since King wrote his speech. And so that's something we have to acknowledge and think about its consequences for the place of the military in our society. I mean, I think one of our challenges has been for the last decade and a half or so that the military recruits unevenly from across our society. And the military is self-conscious about this. They think of this as a problem, that they draw much more significantly from red states than from blue states. And that differential means we have, we do not have actually, I don't think, the same connection to the place of the military in our life as we did when King was writing, where every family was in some such sense touched by experience of the military. So we both have a cohort of veterans who feel often quite neglected by the rest of society, and a sort of fusion of ideological polarization with the sort of line between military and civilian perspectives. And we've watched that unfold as, for example, policing has been affected by the transfer of military equipment into policing contexts and the movement of veterans into policing. And then lines of ideological polarization draw up around that as well. So I think if we don't actually pay attention to the changed place of the military in our social life and the complicated story about that, the story again about sort of ideological polarization, but also the degree to which veterans do often in a real way come back to lives that are not what they expect as people who have served their country. If we don't pay attention to that, I don't think we will really understand the sources of our current conflict. So people first, we need to not abandon one another. I think that's the core. And that is about tackling poverty. It's about tackling disempowerment. It's about building opportunity for people. And I think you can kind of go through the list of ways in which we've let each other down over the last few decades, whether that's people who are trapped inside of violence and violent policing, both things in cities, whether that's people in rural environments who are disconnected from opportunity and mobility, whether that's veterans who don't get decent healthcare when they come back from service or suffer from PTSD for years because we've been in, the Middle East for 20 years now without really addressing the long-term impacts of that. So yes, I believe we should have a principle of non-abandonment, and that we need to nourish the roots of social connection, that we not have dry tinder, which gets set on fire by extremists, as it was done earlier this past winter.
Liz Theoharis.
Yeah, I really appreciate all that has been said, and really want to kind of take up this question or this assertion of how the context has changed since Dr. King made that speech from the Riverside Church on April 4th of '67. And indeed, we don't have a draft, but we do have basically a poverty draft. And there really are almost no poor communities that aren't impacted, both by the militarization of their communities here in the United States, whether it's with equipment, whether it's with the Border Patrol, or whether it's with police forces, as well as then the number of poor people and poor young people who are joining the military because it's the only way to get an education, because it's the only way to put food on their tables, and then indeed return from often being on the front lines of war across the world, only to be able to not have health care, not be able to kind of make an adequate standard of living. And we're seeing this, not as one or two little stories of this, but the majority of single male adults that are homeless in our society are veterans. And frontline battle troops are paid so little that many of their families, can rely on and have to rely on public welfare systems. And so despite the fact that we often will hold up our military, appreciate people for service to the country, that reality is not about, the ideals of a democracy and opportunity and possibility and freedom for all. It's that, indeed, what Dr. King talked about of sending poor people, Black people, Latino people, to go and fight and kill poor people in other parts of the world. And so I think that indeed it calls for a moral revolution of values, where we do put people before profit, where we do put the idea out there that when we lift from the bottom, when we put forward visionary, bold policies that raise wages and expand healthcare, that everybody can actually have a better and fairer shot. And that's, I think, it's the only way that we can kind of heal this society that is so divided and is in so much pain right now.
Liz, I'm going to stick with the question of our military system just for a minute. You're making an argument that I myself have made, that the so-called all-volunteer force is not really a volunteer force. It's not democratic. It's not representative. And quite frankly, it's not very effective. We're fighting all the time, but we don't win. And when I make this argument to a group, the immediate response is, oh, you must be in favor of the draft. Are you in favor of the draft? I'm really posing the question for all of us, because that seems to be the assumed alternative to the military system that we have today. And the political barriers, setting aside other considerations, sort of the political barriers of returning to that military system are immense. So what would you say? Are you in favor of the draft?
Well, what I would say is much the same response as when people talk about the fact that we can't expand healthcare, but it's our politicians that have a universal healthcare system, and so we do need a system where there is fairness and equality in it. But what we also need is a significant reprioritization that would take place to demilitarize our communities and to demilitarize this world. And when we do that, that will make our country and our world a whole lot safer. And it will balance out the role that the military plays in all of our lives. And so right now, the balance is that it's on the backs, the fighting is on the backs of the poor and poor Black and brown and poor white, communities, and that the profiting from it is in the pockets of a smaller group of very elite forces, and that is not good for our democracy.
So changing the military system has to go hand in hand with revising our conception of the role that we're supposed to play, we're called upon to play in the world. Dan, any thoughts on that subject?
On revising the role we're meant to play in the world?
Or revising our military system, the so-called all-volunteer force?
Well, I certainly am not in favor of bringing back the draft. I think the same sort of abuses that we see of our military right now would continue even if we brought the draft back. And of course, having the draft did not prevent us from getting into wars which were rather painful, to say the least, in Korea and Vietnam during the Cold War. I think the result of bringing back the draft would just be to give our politicians who have been irresponsible with the use of our military all the more materials to work with. And in fact, one of the constraints right now that our political class is under is that they have a limited supply of volunteers. There are only so many people, however much we might want to pay the military, who are willing to sign up to do the kinds of operations that our leaders would like to send them on. And right now, most people, they not only have the economic incentive, but there's also a sense of patriotism that inspires them to sign up for the military. But these reserves are limited. And I think that if you, as long as you have the all-volunteer force, it puts a constraint on the scope and the extent of some of the military operations we can undertake. It doesn't, however, of course, put a constraint on the time schedule necessarily. So we've seen with Afghanistan, as long as we have a small enough number of troops there, it seems as if this war can go on forever and ever. But unfortunately, I don't know that the draft would be something that would change that dynamic. As far as other changes that we might make to the armed forces, I don't know of any kind of structural reform that would necessarily bring about the kinds of changes we want to see in our political system. It seems to me that the fundamental problem with our political system is that you have a leadership class that is drifting farther and farther away from the public as a whole. And that's true in terms of education. I mean, the number of congresspeople who have advanced degrees, for example, is much larger than the public as a whole. The number of millionaires, of course, in Congress is far larger than the proportion of millionaires in our country as a whole. Our leadership simply represents a very different sort of American than the ordinary taxpayer, the ordinary soldier, the ordinary worker, the ordinary person, and the ordinary citizen. And that's, I think, a grave problem. The fact that we continue to have, of course, congressional districts whose population grows larger and larger because we have not expanded the House in a very long time means that people are proportionally less represented. I think we are seeing a decay of the idea of local democracy, which is really the strongest kind of democracy within our system, and instead such a mass kind of politics that you wind up with a very unrepresentative elite, and then you wind up with a very alienated and disaffected public.
Nita, I wonder if you would comment on this question of bringing about a radical revolution in values, and maybe connect our penchant for militarism as to whether or not that in and of itself impedes any kind of significant change.
Well, one of the things that impressed me about King's speech was his willingness, maybe because of his background, to speak about love as the foundation of the values and love and compassion. And when he says, we shouldn't think that throwing a coin at a beggar is adequate, but rather we need to look at the system that makes the beggar. I think he's telling us that we have to think systemically and authorizes us then to think about the radical revolution. And he's pointing to the necessity for compassion and for love. So I very much appreciate that. And so that's one emotion. And on the other hand, the other emotion that we haven't really talked about is the fear that drives the extreme materialism and the racism and the militarism. And it's the fear, for instance, that keeps us, with one or two aircraft carriers constantly patrolling the Persian Gulf so that we can protect access to this oil, which is causing the climate change we see. It's the fear of possible militant that causes us to use drone strikes and occupy portions of the world. So I think that if we dealt with our fears more directly, then and thought more about love and compassion, we could actually have a different foreign policy. I know there's a lot of steps to get there, but I think that's where, in part, where King was going. So I think there's good material there. And then, if I might comment on the question of the draft and whether or not we're losing more wars, Daniel was right. We got into some pretty sticky situations with the draft. And if we want to fight a war that requires more people, we would probably quickly see the reinstitutionalization of the draft, because people are still being asked or told to register for the draft. That capacity is still there. But I don't think it's the all volunteer forces per se, which caused let's say, if you want to call it that, the United States doing less well in war. It's the kinds of wars we're fighting. They're probably not winnable and perhaps not worth fighting. And the other thing that you see is the substitution of technology and distance for manpower, boots on the ground. And war doesn't, as King said, solve problems. It, in fact, makes them. It's not possible with war to make a democracy. A long occupation is very difficult, in fact, to do any of that. So I think that the issue isn't, whether it's volunteers who are fighting or regular forces. It's the kinds of wars the United States is engaged in. They're not wars of self-defense. They're about controlling everything, everywhere, all the time.
Well, and they're wars of choice. Danielle, anything to add to sort of that theme?
Well, I'm an advocate for universal expectation of national service, but with that defined broadly. So not restoring the draft, not requirement for military service, but I am an advocate for the idea that we should invest with public funds in equipping our young people with that experience. Purposes there are bridge building, having young people work together on projects of common purpose. Also at the moment, I think there are sort of two poles of service. There is the military, where people are recruited often from conditions of poverty, and then the pay is not great, as Reverend Theo Harris was saying. And then you have affluent kids who get other kinds of service opportunities, a gap year between high school and college. And I think we have to right the balance there and actually provide a service opportunity broadly at a level of pay and compensation that makes it in fact doable, and a step for people out of poverty to the next opportunity. So I think that would count, as in some sense a revolution in values. It would be about a sort of service ethos rather than a militarist ethos, but some of the things that can be productive for a society out of a work, common purpose, you could tap into that way. But I do think, I hope what I'm saying makes clear that we have to pay attention to the intersection between the issues of poverty and issues of service. And the thing that we should build needs to address that underlying issue of poverty, as well as opening up the possibility of collaboration across lines of difference.
I guess I'd like you and the others to reflect a bit on whether the culture, our collective culture, as it exists today, has the capacity to embrace this call for radical change. We are a liberal capitalist society. There is, I think I'm right, but if I'm not, tell me. There are things in our society that incentivize selfishness. And I just have to wonder whether or not collectively we have the capacity to embark upon the kind of change that you're describing, which I personally find very attractive. But how do we implement, I guess, is the question.
Well, I'll just say a small thing, but I'm sure others want to jump in. At some level, we have to have the capacity because we're human beings and we can't give up on that potential. Otherwise, we're giving up on ourselves. So in that regard, I'm sure we have the capacity. The question is, can we find ourselves the pathway? Can we lead ourselves there? And so I do think that does require leadership. Reverend Barber, Reverend Theo Harris, who are articulating a people first commitment, who are articulating a principle of non-abandonment. For me, the pandemic was a really powerful moment. I was quite shocked in the beginning of that at how easy it seemed to people to imagine sort of abandoning whole swaths of our population. So some of that loose talk early on, for example, about not needing to worry about protecting older people, or maybe they should just sacrifice themselves so we could carry on without trying to suppress COVID. And so I do think that there is a deep moral corruption in our society, that we don't recognize our literal human connection, human responsibility to one another. And I do think that is, to Daniel's point, it's a sort of matter of grassroots rebuilding, of actually finding points of human connection and calling out their importance, and calling out the kind of responsibility of non-abandonment that flows from that human connection.
Nita, do you see that moral corruption?
Sure. And I also see a lot of positive things happening. For instance, protect the vote, which a lot of other organizations were anticipating that Trump would try to derail the democratic process. Months before he began to lay the groundwork for that, people were organized to protect the vote, and they did it at a grassroots level. That's just a recent example of local democracy at work. But if you look at the climate change as another example, you see that all across the world, people are actually voting, working, changing at the grassroots level the systems of economy. And in fact, just the fact of moving to renewables is the kind of economic change that democratizes power. And when power, that is electrical power, motive power, is democratized, there's more scope for other kinds of democratization. Or if you look at the peace movement, it is actually quite robust. And the activities in Europe, as well as in Thailand and Myanmar, and even in Latin America, are all about the building of democracy and against militarism at a grassroots level. And these things are inspiring. So I think that we definitely have, as Danielle says, the capacity, but I think that people are not stuck there and sort of wondering, what to do. They're actually acting.
I think I'm too old and I get therefore too pessimistic here. I mean, to Dan's point, we have a Congress which is not entirely representative. I have to say, in my judgment, utterly dysfunctional and riddled with corruption, filled with millionaires. It doesn't seem like an entity that is going to respond to the challenges that you're identifying. In other words, there's grassroots activism, but in the center of power, it seems to me that there's very considerable resistance and inaction. Do you see it differently?
Well, I think that Senator Ed Markey, when he was a member of Congress, used to say that Congress is a stimulus response organism. And then basically what he was trying to say is that they respond to the people. And I think that to a certain extent, that's what we're seeing, except the right wing has been very well mobilized at the primary stage. And we have to change that. We need to change the climate of opinion so that the wind blows a different way and Congress wants to go a different way. But I actually am not so much myself moved by what happens in DC. I think that we have to be the change out in the communities that we are. And that's about actually democracy where we work, where we live, the organizations that we belong to. And the other thing I want to say is that there's a very tight link, and Daniel was talking about this concentration of wealth in the members of the House and the Senate. But there's also a very tight link between these members and the military-industrial complex, right? So there's a base everywhere, if not a base, some corporation that people think that they have to keep those people satisfied, and they've also convinced themselves that military spending leads to jobs and better jobs than they would otherwise get. And we have to break that connection. And there's two ways to break that connection. One is to do a thorough analysis of the consequences of military spending, which are actually not to produce more jobs, but to produce fewer jobs. And it's also to do a thorough analysis of what we could be doing instead, and how productive those things could be, sort of offering an alternative to the military industrial complex. And I think that will take some of the wind out of the sails of those members who are dependent on the contributions of military industrial corporations.
Dan, your thoughts on how to counter the influence of the military industrial complex, or perhaps even more broadly, the notion that our safety and security depends on having a globally deployed force, the 800 bases, the aircraft carriers constantly at sea. What's the antidote to that?
Yeah, the threat inflation, which is endemic to the outlook of our political leaders when it comes to foreign policy, is kind of difficult to counter. And it may be a case that because they have so many tools at their disposal in the form of the military industrial complex and in the form of any number of theories which tell them that they should be active in the world, whether for humanitarian purposes or whether to counteract some perceived threat out there. They have so many tools at their disposal that they may feel as if they absolutely have to find some object for those tools. If they have a hammer, then they must find a nail. So I think that it's very difficult to get them to change their point of view. But as far as the military-industrial complex is concerned, it'd be nice to have more of a complex that is not military. It may be industrial, but is not simply about this creation of weapon systems, which are, of course, they do supply jobs at the moment, and people do quite rightly wonder what kind of jobs they will have if the factories close down, if the military bases close down. And of course, these factories and military bases are spread throughout regions of the country that otherwise have suffered a great deal of industrial decline. And I think that one of the key questions here, which it goes to Congress, it goes to so many of our, sort of op-ed columnists and newspapers and spokespersons on the television, is what you are going to do for the part of America, which is significant, that depends upon real sort of industrial work, hard industry. Whether indeed, as so many of our leadership seems to believe, America is going to become a thoroughly post-industrial country and everyone should move into computer programming or insurance salesmanship or something like that, or whether in fact we really do need to have an industrial base, in which case we have to adopt policies that are appropriate for that base, even if they are somewhat inconvenient for Wall Street. And ideally, we should be adopting policies that are not simply about militarism. They are going to be about our ability to make things that the rest of the world wants to buy, that our own consumers want to buy, and that, of course, provide good paying jobs for men and women across the country.
Liz, on this point of, I guess it's economic transition, I wonder if you talk a little bit about that. I mean, I remember the globalization fad of the early 1990s when Bill Clinton and others were telling us that the information economy was going to make everybody rich. And there might be a couple of bumps in the road, but everybody was going to benefit. There was significant change to our economy, and a lot of people were left behind. How can we adapt our economy, perhaps reducing the penchant for military spending and war, and at the same time move towards greater equitability?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a key question in this moment. And one of the things that we know even about this pandemic and the economic recession that has now followed is that we got to this place because of the fissures that existed in society. And those fissures were racism, were poverty, were a militarization of our communities, right? And then this virus spread in those fissures, definitely impacting first and worst poor people and people of color the most. Before the pandemic even hit, we were having 700 people die every day from just poverty and inequality. And so we surely need some kind of economic transition. We can't, in this moment now go back to normal, right? Normal was, again, 250,000 people in the richest country in human history to die from inequality. When those that are the richest are making untold profits. And so, I think that, again, Dr. King, in that Beyond Vietnam sermon, I think makes some of the very connections that we need today, even though things have changed. He basically said the Achilles heel of this tripartite system of kind of evil, the Achilles heel, the weak point of racism and poverty and militarism is for poor people to come together, organize together, band together across geography, across race, across political persuasion, across sexuality, across religion, right? All of the different things that divide us, and put forward, a economic bill of rights, a program that could lift people out of the kind of crisis that society was in, that many years ago, let alone today. And And so I think what we need is indeed, as Nita was saying, right? Every dollar we spend on the military in terms of jobs, we could do a lot better if we invested in healthcare jobs, if we invested in infrastructure. There are communities all across this country that do not have the kind of infrastructure or sanitation systems, right? We have a way of actually addressing those issues that would create jobs, and it would demilitarize our planet. If we shifted jobs and development towards the things that actually save life here and across the world.
We are almost out of time. I thank you for that statement. I'd like to let Danielle and then Nita and then Dan each make a closing comment. Probably needs to be brief. We've only got about 3 minutes left total, and then we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Danielle, final thoughts?
Well, we do need to move forward on an economic paradigm that rebuilds opportunity for people across the country. So I won't say more than that right now, but I want to endorse that that is just fundamentally important work.
Thank you. Nita, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think climate change gives us the opportunity to have an industrial policy that provides jobs. But climate change also threatens our democracy fundamentally, because it will exacerbate inequality. And to the extent that the US military sees it as requiring a militarized response, it's going to increase military spending, which will exacerbate inequality. So it's also important to understand how the military contributes to climate change, because it's the largest greenhouse gas emitter, single emitter in the world as an institution, and it's the largest portion of US governmental emissions. So we can link these problems, and Liz Theo Harris did that earlier, and I failed to double down on that, but I think that's important.
Dan, last word is yours.
I would just say that there's a challenge that has to be met both at the material level and also at the moral level. At the material level, it's the question of what kind of economy will we have in the 21st century that will work for all Americans, and not just for the Americans who are most fortunate or in the upper middle class and most educated. We need to have an economy that also works for people who so far have been left behind. And beyond that, I would say that I agree very much with Nita and Danielle about the need for this local community activity, and that this is where the moral dimension comes in. It's the face-to-face interaction and rebuilding communities, rebuilding friendships, and generally creating the kinds of support networks that are necessary to make a republic function. And that's something which, there's an element here that does have to be done at the national level in terms of certain industrial policies that we might have to set, but there are also so much more that needs to be done at the local level in terms of repairing our communities through the effort of men and women in those communities themselves.
Well, what a rich conversation. I am deeply grateful to you all for participating in this. And I am now going to turn things back over to Trita Parsi, who will close out the proceedings. Again, thank you very much. Trita.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Let me echo your comments. This was a tremendously rich and valuable conversation. Thank you so much to Danielle, to Dan, to Liz, to Nita, for participating. It is the beginning, obviously, of a conversation that is going to take quite a bit more time, but it's quite clear that these three elements are intertwined, and you cannot really resolve the crisis that the United States is facing internally without addressing all three of them. Before I let everyone go, wanted to just plug our next webinar that will be taking place this Thursday at 1:30. It will be on how Joe Biden can and should end the war in Yemen. He has made a very good decision in calling for an end to US support for offensive Saudi operations, but in our view, that is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to end the war or the US's involvement in it. We'll have a great conversation. We will have Congressman Ro Khanna, who's played a leading role in the House on this issue, as well as Aisha Juman, the president and the founder of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, as well as QI's own Anel Shiline. So please join us then. And if you haven't already, please go to quincyins.org and sign up for our mailing list so that you will get notification of all of our events as well as our publications. Thank you all so much and hope to see you Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all